Padre Pio once told a broken man over 60 that God doesn't keep alive what has no purpose. If your heart is still beating, there's a reason heaven hasn't called you home yet, and it's bigger than you think. A white-haired man walks into the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo on a cold October morning in 1959. He was past 60 years old. He held a worn rosary in his hands and the weight of an entire lifetime in his eyes. He had lost his youngest son. He had buried his wife. He had survived a war that devoured everything around him. And yet, there he was. Padre Pio looked at him for a long moment before speaking. He didn't ask about sins. He didn't request a confession. He said only one thing, a single sentence that man carried for the rest of his life and repeated to everyone willing to listen. The man tried to respond, tried to say he was too old, too tired, too broken to matter anymore. But before he could finish the sentence, Padre Pio raised his hand, the hand marked by the stigmata, and spoke with a calm that cut through the air like a blade. God does not keep alive what no longer has purpose. The man never walked out the same way he walked in. And what Padre Pio revealed in that confessional, about why God still keeps some people standing when so many others have already been called home, will open the eyes of anyone who still hasn't understood why their heart is still beating past the age of 60. A white-haired man walks into the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo on a cold October morning in 1959. He was past 60 years old. He held a worn rosary in his hands and the weight of an entire lifetime in his eyes. He had lost his youngest son. He had buried his wife. He had survived a war that devoured everything around him. And yet, there he was. Padre Pio looked at him for a long moment before speaking. He didn't ask about sins. He didn't request a confession. He said only one thing, a single sentence that man carried for the rest of his life and repeated to everyone willing to listen. The man tried to respond, tried to say he was too old, too tired, too broken to matter anymore. But before he could finish the sentence, Padre Pio raised his hand, the hand marked by the stigmata, and spoke with a calm that cut through the air like a blade. God does not keep alive what no longer has purpose. The man never walked out the same way he walked in, and what Padre Pio revealed in that confessional about why God still keeps some people standing when so many others have already been called home will open the eyes of anyone who still hasn't understood why their heart is still beating past the age of 60. But what Padre Pio was about to reveal in that confessional was not simply about age. It was about something most people never recognize in their own lives, a truth so close it becomes invisible, a purpose so real it gets mistaken for ordinary survival. But to understand what Padre Pio meant, you first need to understand something about the world he lived in, something almost no one outside the walls of San Giovanni Rotondo fully knew. He had spent decades watching people arrive broken, convinced their story was finished. And he had seen, again and again, what God does with a life that still has breath in it. This is not a secondary detail. It is the key without which everything that follows loses the weight it deserves. And that is exactly what will be shown right now. There was something about Padre Pio that had no parallel among the men of his time. He bore the wounds of Christ in his own body for 50 years. He was documented to have been in 2 places at once. He read the souls of those who came to him with an accuracy that left theologians speechless and skeptics without answers. These were not legends invented after his death. They were recorded by the Vatican, witnessed by physicians, confirmed by journalists and ordinary people who had no reason to fabricate what they saw. This is not speculation. It is archived in official ecclesiastical records, in sworn testimonies collected over decades, in letters written by those who encountered him and could not explain what they had witnessed. Multiple people who had never met each other, who came from different countries and different walks of life, confirmed the same pattern. He knew things no one had told him. He saw things no human eye should have been able to see. The consistency of those testimonies made fabrication essentially impossible. He also saw something that most confessors never confront directly. He sat across from thousands of men and women who had passed the age of 60 and believed, with genuine conviction, that their most important years were behind them, that God had already used them and was simply waiting to receive them, that they were, in spiritual terms, finished. Padre Pio understood something about that belief that the majority of people never considered. He did not argue with it gently, he dismantled it completely, and it is exactly because of this, because of what he witnessed, what he recorded, and what he declared, that what Padre Pio said about why God keeps a soul alive after 60 carries a weight that no theory can match. He was not speaking from a book. He was speaking from what he saw. And now, exactly what that was will be shown. The teaching Padre Pio returned to, again and again, was this: preserved life is purposeful life, not preserved in the way people assume, not simply kept breathing until the final hour arrives. He was speaking of something far more intentional and far more demanding than that. This may seem like a comforting idea at first, a gentle reassurance for the aging, but Padre Pio understood something about preserved life that most people never stop long enough to consider. He saw it not as a gift to be received passively, but as a commission to be carried actively. Preserved life is not retirement from God's work. It is reassignment to the deepest part of it. He once said to a spiritual directee whose name appears in his recorded correspondence, a woman in her late 60s who had written to him believing her usefulness had ended, that God does not maintain what he has finished with. A candle is not kept burning in an empty room. If the flame is still there, so is the reason for the light. That single image carries more weight than it first appears, because what it implies is not merely comforting. It is confronting. It means that every morning a person over 60 opens their eyes. They are receiving a direct, unambiguous message from heaven. Not yet. There is still something here that only you can do. When that truth is ignored, when those years are spent waiting rather than walking, shrinking rather than standing, something is lost that cannot be recovered. Not just in the life of the individual, but in the lives of everyone that person was specifically preserved to reach. And now, exactly how this manifests, and why almost everyone carries this without realizing it, will be shown. One of the most common ways preserved purpose manifests is in what can be called the testimony no one else can give. Every person past 60 carries a specific history with God that is entirely unrepeatable. The prayers that were answered after years of waiting, the moments when collapse seemed certain and something held, the losses that should have destroyed faith and somehow deepened it instead. This history is not personal decoration. It is documented evidence of divine faithfulness that the next generation has not yet lived long enough to possess. This testimony disguises itself as ordinary memory, just old stories, just things that happened a long time ago. That is precisely why so many people keep it to themselves. And it is exactly there that purpose goes unspent. Padre Pio saw this clearly. He understood that silence in the face of witnessed grace is not humility. It is a kind of spiritual withholding. He would tell those who came to him, speak of what God has done, not to boast, but because someone listening is about to give up, and your story is the reason they won't. A second manifestation is the wisdom that only suffering produces. The world is full of information. It is starving for wisdom, and wisdom of the kind that anchors a frightened soul. The kind that says, I have been where you are, and here is what I know, cannot be downloaded, cannot be taught in a classroom, cannot be manufactured. It is forged across decades of real life, decades of choosing faith when fear was louder, of forgiving when bitterness would have been easier, of returning to God after seasons of distance. This wisdom disguises itself as something the younger generation wouldn't want, too old, too slow, too far from what they're facing. But Padre Pio recognized this lie immediately. He knew that the principles of God do not age, and that a soul who has walked with him through changing decades carries something priceless to a generation drowning in noise and uncertainty. He said, more than once, that the greatest danger facing the young is not the absence of information. It is the absence of someone who has already survived what they are afraid of. A third manifestation is the power of intercession. This one is perhaps the most overlooked, because it requires nothing visible, no platform, no stage, no audience, only a soul willing to stand in the gap for another. Padre Pio was himself one of the most powerful intercessors of the 20th century. He spent hours in prayer for people he had never met and would never meet in this life. And he believed, with complete conviction, that no prayer offered in genuine faith was ever wasted or unanswered. He taught that those in the later years of life often carry the greatest capacity for this kind of prayer, because they have been stripped of many of the distractions that make intercession difficult in younger years. The career, the ambition, the noise of building a life, these grow quieter, and in that quiet, something powerful becomes available, a closeness to God that younger souls are still working toward. This disguises itself as doing nothing, sitting in a chair, closing one's eyes, speaking words no one else hears. But Padre Pio knew what those words could move. He had seen it. He had lived it. He told one spiritual daughter that a single hour of sincere prayer from a soul fully surrendered to God could reach places no human foot could travel and touch hearts no human hand could reach. A fourth manifestation is the grace of being a living example, not a perfect one, a real one. There is a particular kind of authority that belongs only to someone who has failed, been forgiven, and kept walking, who has doubted, returned, and kept believing, who has been broken, healed, and kept trusting. That authority does not come from perfection. It comes from endurance, and it speaks to watching souls in a way that polished words never can. Padre Pio once wrote that the greatest sermon a person can preach is a life that refuses to quit. Not a life without wounds. A life that carries its wounds without bitterness and keeps moving toward God. There are people in every circle of influence, family, neighborhood, community, who are watching exactly that. Who are deciding, based on what they observe, whether faith is real or merely convenient. Whether God actually holds people through suffering or only through comfort. The life of someone past 60 who is still standing, still faithful, still soft-hearted after everything they have endured. That life answers the question. He would say to those who felt invisible in their later years, "You are not invisible. You are being studied. And what those watching you are learning from your steadiness is something no sermon could teach as clearly." He said to pray without ceasing, to forgive without conditions, to trust without demanding explanations. And he promised that a life lived this way would leave marks on eternity that the person living it would not fully see until they crossed into the next life. And now, what changes when a person truly begins to live this way will be shown. That white-haired man who walked into the confessional that October morning in 1959, he walked out different. Not because Padre Pio said something complicated, not because he received a vision or a miracle, but because he heard something true, something that cut through the lie he had been carrying for years. The lie that his best days were behind him. That God was simply waiting for him to finish. He lived 11 more years after that morning, and those who knew him said the last 11 were the most alive he had ever been. Padre Pio himself lived this until the very end. Despite the pain of the stigmata, despite decades of suffering, despite attacks visible and invisible, he kept praying, kept receiving, kept speaking truth into the lives of everyone who came to him. He did not slow into irrelevance. He deepened into purpose. And when he died on September 23, 1968, his last words were the names of Jesus and Mary. He finished exactly as he had lived, pointing toward something greater than himself. The question this teaching leaves behind is simple, and it is uncomfortable. If God has kept you alive past 60, past the storms, past the losses, past the nights you weren't sure you would see the morning, what are you doing with the days he is still giving you? The question is not whether you recognize your purpose. The question is what you will do with it starting today. If this message helped you see something you had not seen before, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like, because teachings like this need to reach more people, and your participation is what makes that possible.